Welcome to Hull here in South Africa and around the world. My name is Gaylor Montmasson-Clair. I'm a senior economist at Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies, known as TIPS. It's really my pleasure to be your facilitator for this virtual development dialogue today. For those who do not know TIPS, just a quick background. We are an economic policy research institute based in South Africa, and our mandate is to support the development of public policy in support of inclusive economic development, social progress, and environmental sustainability. We engage in policy research, in capacity building, and in knowledge dissemination and dialogue. So today's event is really at the intersect of our work. It focuses on unraveling stakeholder perspectives with regard to South Africa's just transition. So it builds on a previous event which occurred somewhere in July. If you unfortunately missed it, the recording is available. It is available on the TIPS website. There was also a link available in the invite to this webinar, and we'll post the link in the chat box as well. And we invite you to really check it out, and we also will record this very session. So why the need for this dialogue today? As most of you know, the concept of a just transition has rapidly risen to prominence globally and in South Africa over the last few years, even though it's a relatively old concept, as we'll hear today. It emerges as the world embarks on the transition to a more sustainable model of development, that so-called inclusive green economy, which strive to merge economic development, social progress, environmental sustainability. And I think here the key word is thriving. We are far from that yet. It is ambitious, in a sense. It is disruptive because it aims to depart from the business as usual, but of course much progress remains to be done. In some ways, and some may disagree, the need for a just transition has emerged to ensure that actually social progress and inclusivity doesn't fall through the wayside in that process. And it came from the labor movement specifically in that respect. Discussion and work on the just transition have been exponentially vibrant in South Africa over the last couple of years and globally. I mean, it's hard to ignore discussions and work around this in the country and in others contexts as well. Yet, stakeholders largely engage among themselves, rarely with each other. And while everyone speaks of just transition, this sort of just transition lingo, a close look really reveals vastly different understanding of what a just transition means, who it should benefit, and how it should occur. These are some of the questions that we aim to unpack today, and we are very pleased to have with us a great panel to discuss those issues. So very briefly, let me run you through the program for the next couple of hours. We'll kickstart with a short introduction from TIPS on some sort of background on the just transition, leveraging what we heard in the previous discussion a couple of months ago. Then I'll give the floor to our four speakers, which I will introduce in due course. We're all involved in the just transition in some shape or form in their respective capacity. We'll give them the floor for about 7-8 minutes each to start reflecting on what the just transition means to them, how they see it unfolding in South Africa, maybe some of the convergence points, some of the fault lines that exist. And then we'll enter in a more interactive discussion. I want to encourage all of you to use the chat box on your right-hand side, as well as the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen to ask questions, and I will definitely relay as many as I can to our presenters. If we feel brave, we may even go for some live questions. Let's see how the technology goes. But without further ado, let me hand the digital floor to my colleague, Marvin Patel, who is an economist at TIPS and has been deeply involved in the work that TIPS has been doing on the just transition, the National Employment Vulnerability Assessment and the Sector Job Resilience Plan that TIPS did for the Departments of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, as well as Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. Marvin will introduce some of the key concepts that we discussed in the previous dialogue, just to make sure that we're all on the same page and that we all come from the same starting point. Marvin?
Thanks, Gaylor. So yeah, as Gaylor mentioned, I'm Mohammed Patel. I'm an economist at TIPS. And quite involved with our just transition work over the past couple of years. So the idea is just to give a brief introduction to the just transition concept, just drawing on some of the points that were made in the previous dialogue, and to just get a sense of some of the main themes that emerged from the session. So just to recap on the just transition as a concept, as Gaylor mentioned, it's not a new concept. It's been around for a while, originated in the late 70s, specifically around toxic cleanup policies. And in the US, it was found that certain minority groups were typically excluded when workers were displaced by these policies. And the idea was to put the most vulnerable at the forefront when thinking about environmental policy. Over time, the concept has evolved. It moved beyond just cleanup policies to the consideration of climate change in more general, and it's also moved in terms of who the vulnerable groups to focus on are. So initially, it was displaced workers, but over time, it's and specifically when applied to the energy sector, it's a consideration of communities and vulnerable workers that are impacted by environmental policies. So it was started by the labor movement. Over time, as the labor movement engaged in various global forums, like with UN bodies, the thinking moved to a global level, where it eventually made its way into the preamble of the 2015 Paris Agreement. So over time, it's reached prominence as a concept. In South Africa, when we think about the just transition, most often it's the conversation is had with respect to energy and the departure from coal. But it's important to understand that the just transition is a type of thinking that's beyond energy. It's not just about coal and energy, but it's about various types of transitions that will occur over time as a result of climate change. So when we think about the just transition in South Africa, there are a lot of countries that have gone through different types of transitions that we can learn from. There's precedent around types of policy tools and levers that are used to support vulnerable workers and communities. So there's a rich precedent to draw from when we think about the just transition in South Africa. From the previous dialogue, some of the important learnings and themes that have come up in the discussion I've kind of categorized them into 4 groups here. So from a scope perspective, some of the points that came from the discussion were that the just transition is an economy and society-wide process. So it's not just it's not just the just energy transition, but it concerns any type of transition in an economy and the prioritization of the most vulnerable in society. Another theme that emerged was the fact that the just transition should be central to all type of planning and processes when we think about environmental policies or sustainable development. There's also an imperative because of the discoordinated or the uncoordinated fashion in which activities and projects are currently happening, there's an imperative for the thinking to be mainstreamed across all stakeholders within government and outside of government. There's a lot of myths over time that have been formed when people talk about just transition. So again, to reinforce the point, it's not just about energy policy. It's not just about it's a departure from coal towards renewables, but it's a more broader discussion about how the most vulnerable in society can be elevated in our policy planning. From an implementation point of view, there's a lot of projects going on. We as TIPS have been involved in the NEVA SGRP process, and there are many other stakeholders that are interested in just transition. Most recently, the NBI, for example, is busy formulating the Just Transition Pathways project from the private sector. So there's a lot of research and analysis that's going on, but currently it's done in a very uncoordinated fashion. So there's a real need for all of this analysis to culminate in something and to be united and form a future pathway for the transition in South Africa. There's also an imperative to move to implementation. So we know a lot from the research and the analysis and looking at the literature, etc. But we know that the energy transition, for example, has already begun with the shift to renewables, and there's not much in terms of implementation that's happened from a just transition perspective, and there's a real need for that. Finally, from a needs point of view, stakeholders differ in terms of what they understand by a just transition, what it means. Some people think it's just about climate mitigation. Other people have a different view. So there's a real need to unite stakeholders on the vision for the process to work and for the vulnerable to be shielded by the impacts of these transitions. There's also a need for, on the ground and local authorities to be empowered and for stakeholders to play a part in economic diversification and for that to be part of the transition. And finally, there's an imperative for a coordinated approach and for a specific institution to have the mandate to pursue this. We know that government departments, for example, have different mandates, but the just transition really cuts across different departments and their mandates. So there needs to be one type of body to unite this. And we saw the P4C that came out of the Job Summit, and we hope that that's finalized soon. And just to end off here and to, I guess, kickstart the discussion is from the previous dialogue, we saw some areas of convergence and we saw some areas of divergence. In terms of where stakeholders agreed, people agree that there's a need for just transition thinking when we talk about economic transitions and, in a country such as South Africa, where there's such a high degree of inequality, protecting the vulnerable and reducing that inequality is a way in which the just transition can contribute. Coal and the energy transition is the most immediate and palpable concern given South Africa's investment in coal and given that it accounts for a large part of our economy and energy generation. So this is where the just transition would most likely be immediately applied. But this is not the only place for just transition thinking. Not pursuing a just transition will certainly result in political economy tensions, given South Africa's inequality. And from a development point of view, it's perverse to forget about small and local economies that have traditionally been geared towards a single economic activity like mining in Mpumalanga, for example. Where stakeholders diverge is, once again, in the definition of a just transition, what it means, who it is to be prioritized for support. There's differing views in terms of whether the just transition is a long-term policy planning process versus whether it's just a project planning process. So you have a project here and you have a project there, and that is what the just transition is. So stakeholders differ in what it means and what the process is about. There's also differing views about whether the current socioeconomic system can cater to one that adequately shields and supports the vulnerable. And here into the debates there comes different types of ownership models, for example, community-based energy generation and the like. So stakeholders have different views about whether the current paradigm can support a just transition. And finally, stakeholders differ in terms of who should lead, who should be involved, and who has what responsibility in this process. So that's a kind of to kickstart the discussion and a recap of the previous discussions. And yeah, I'm happy to hear what our guests today have to say from their different points of view. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mohammed. I think that's very, very useful to kind of kickstart the discussion, see if some of our panelists kind of agree or disagree with some of the things that you raised. I think that's why we're here today. I want to first kick us off and give the floor to Ashraf Kariem. Ashraf is Chief Expert Economy in the National Planning Commission Secretariat within the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, the DPME. He was part of the team overseeing the NPC just transition process that unfolded over about 18 months. And that's going to kind of drive a lot of the momentum going forward. So Ashraf, if you can unmute yourself and start your video.
I'm trying to address your question from the perspective of the National Planning Commission's work, right? So as we all know, within the NDP itself, right, on Chapter 5 of the NDP, there was a call in Chapter 5 for a transition by 2030 towards a more climate resilient economy, low carbon, climate resilient economy. But the Chapter 5 itself didn't provide necessarily a pathway towards that, right? It was not a plan, right? But it was just a framework, was concrete proposals. So when the second commission came into being, it then embarked on a process to deepen the work in Chapter 5, right? And some of you, if I look at the names, you were partly involved. So the NPC then started a dialogue process, right, to get to a just transition. And this process involved a series of dialogues with civil society, business, government, labor, communities, and experts. But the process itself started with a social partner dialogue and progress to workshops in each province, as well as engagement with various constituencies such as youth, labor, and business, through bilateral meetings, roundtables, partnerships, etc. And we concluded with a conference on the 29th of May in terms of this process. The intention was then, after the May concluding conference, to have a final conference where we would adopt a vision and a pathway, but then due to the coronavirus, well, I'm making a mistake. The concluding conference was intended to be the 29th of May, but that didn't take place because of the coronavirus. So hopefully one day we will get to it. But let me leave the conclusion of how the NPC sees this process being concluded to the end of my chat, right? So I'm just reminding me, I must indicate that. Now, in terms of what the NPC adopted, right, as what a just transition was, the NPC deliberately adopted what we called an economy-wide scope, right, for a just transition. And it dealt with three key sectors, namely energy, water, and land use, right? And this is the belief that this starting point was necessary because ultimately, if we're talking about a just transition, we're talking about how do we deal fundamentally not only with the big issues, but how do we deal with the issues that impact people's lives, in particular the poor and the most vulnerable. Now, I see Mohammed has already described the idea that that the just transition, as we all know, comes from the trade union movement, and that was the starting point for the NPC as well, right? To start off with those guidelines that for just transition from the International Labour Organization. But for the purposes of the NPC process, it adopted the broadened approach for just transition that also included defending and protecting the rights of the most vulnerable, including women, children, people with disabilities, those that are poor, and the working class more broadly, right? And the reason for this is that global climate change scientists agree that those who are most vulnerable to climate change are the poor, particularly in the developing countries and regions. So that is the reason for it, right? And if you look at our triple challenges are characterized, and therefore we use the three, our triple challenges, because the poor is fundamentally vulnerable to climate change, low adaptive capacities of the most vulnerable to climate change are characterized by inadequate access to the three key resources: productive land use, water, and energy, right? And therefore, that was the reason for the concentration on those issues. I'm not sure if you want me to go into detail of what the stakeholders said during this process. However, right, two of the big issues that came about, right, from the stakeholder engagement process is that stakeholders argue matters around governance, right? They raise the issues or the need for a strong government role in ensuring a just transition, right? So the issues of capacity, knowledge, and skills in government were identified as critical for successful management and implementation for a just transition. And the other main issue that the stakeholders raised, right? Although there was a general agreement, right, that on the structure of the economy, South Africa would need to shift from a minerals and energy complex path dependency, right? So there needs to be a transitioning from an extractive-based and resource-intensive economy to one that is more sustainable and one that respects ecological boundaries and promotes human development So in terms of the two big issues that the dialogue process unfolded, it was around those two matters, right? And then just maybe before I conclude, so as I've indicated, the three big issues was around land use, energy, and water, right? And these were seen as interconnected and interdependent, and there needs to be a more detailed focus, right, as we develop the pathways on these three issues. Then, just to conclude, in terms of the process going forward, right? Because of the fact of that the NPC, well, the term has been extended by about 6 months. The term was supposed to come to an end of September. They now have been extended till March. However, that still doesn't give them enough time to deal with these matters. So there was a decision taken that the work that the NPC has started, right, needs to be concluded, hopefully by what is called the presidential, I hope I get this correct now, the Presidential Commission on Climate Change that was part of the agreement of the Job Summit My understanding is there has been already a terms of reference agreed on the PCCC, and as soon as they are established and formed, then the Planning Commission will then hand over this work to them. Can I just make one more point, is that the work did create a Vision 2050, right? And the vision law basically states, and I'm going to read it because there's fundamentally the one issue, and it's part of the question that you've asked us to address, Gaylor. The one issue that seemed not to be addressed is whether it should be zero carbon or net zero, right? So the vision that came out was fundamentally something that goes like this: putting people first, especially those living in poverty and the vulnerable at the forefront. South Africa will have achieved a zero carbon or a net zero carbon economy by 2050, right? So that is a broad idea around the Vision 2050 that came from this process. So the main concern is still whether or not, right, and in the dialogue process, whether we're talking about zero carbon or not, or net zero carbon. And it is probably a debate that will define the process going forward of what we mean for how we reach 2050. What does this concept mean, and what does it mean for the impact on the economy? That's my story. I'm not sure if you've got questions or any clarifications, but that's it.
Thanks a lot, Ashraf. I think that's yeah, very good overview of what that's unfolded with the NPC process, and I guess some indication of what's going to happen going forward. Of course, we're all eagerly awaiting the establishment of this presidential commission. Hopefully, we'll have the clout and the resources to be effective and have an impact. I think we can just get back to that as well in the discussion. I want to now move to our next panelist before we carry on, and we'll have discussions once we've given everyone a chance to hear their views. Our next speaker is Chair. The Chair is a non-for-profit shareholder activism organization, and it's been doing really great work on supporting a shift in the corporate world around accountability and sustainability. She's really one of the country's experts in terms of responsible investment, shareholder activism, and corporate governance and transparency. So Tracey, very keen to hear your views on the topic. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Gaylor. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining this morning. Yeah, so Just Share's view of the world is that our financial system drives climate change and entrenches inequality, our current financial system, and that we need radical, responsible investment if we are going to achieve a just and inclusive economy. So Gaylor asked each of us to explain what we see, how we view the just transition from our perspectives. And from Just Share's perspective, there are two main components in our understanding of a just transition. The first is, of course, the transition to a low-carbon economy in order to tackle climate change. But the second element, the equally important element, is that that transition does not simply perpetuate our existing socio-economic challenges and problems, not just in South Africa, obviously, but across the world. We were also asked to comment on what we think others think the just transition process means. And I think when I was thinking about that question, the thing that struck me actually was that there are still far too many people who don't even know what a just transition is. They have not even heard of the concept of a just transition. So, we have these panel discussions and these webinars, and everyone who signs up to them is in some respects either an expert in this subject or somebody who wants to learn more about it. But there is a vast mass of people out there, you know, who've never heard of this issue. And I think that's possibly one of our biggest challenges, is that we, people like us on this webinar, are still very much in a bubble or a silo, talking about something that needs to be implemented by the globe, by the whole planet. And we can't even come to a common understanding amongst ourselves as to what a just transition process is. So of course, different people will have different views depending on their perspective of the world, and understandably people in the coal mining industry will have a very different view of a just transition than people who work for my organization, for example. But I think what we have seen in the last couple of years, and it's really only the last couple of years that we can even start to say that this concept or term has gained some mainstream kind of airing in South Africa, is that I'm finding it very interesting to see how people try and kind of twist the words around what a just transition is to kind of suit their own priorities. And you know, you are seeing quite a few people, so, no, I won't specify exactly who they are or where they come from, but starting to say, well, you know, the concept of just transition basically means that in South Africa we can't move away from fossil fuels, because if we move away from fossil fuels, that will be unjust to all the people who depend on our fossil fuel economy. So there's a bit of a willful, I think, misunderstanding going on there. What I also find extraordinary is how many people still don't hear the word transition. So in my line of work, the most immediate response I still get always when I start talking about this issue is, we can't just shut down all the coal-fired power stations tomorrow. We can't close all the coal mines. Or there are people employed in those industries. You'll tank the South African economy. And I think that this is, it's so strange, because the word just transition to me, it says, you know, it encapsulates the need for this to be a process that happens over a period of time, not a short, sharp shock, which is what is going to happen, of course, if we don't tackle this in a much more urgent manner than we have thus far. So as Mohammed, you know, was referring to, and as I think a number of the processes that are going on around this issue in South Africa have recognized, until we have a uniform vision, or at least some kind of agreement on what this looks like, we're going to be unable to move forward. So just briefly, how Just Share is involved in this process. We look at climate risk very much from the perspective of the financial sector. And you'll see this all over the world, that in response to governments everywhere doing far too little to tackle climate change, there has been a growing and increasing realization that actually if you can shut off the financial flows to fossil fuels, then it doesn't really matter what government policy is, because it's going to be very difficult to perpetuate those industries. So we have focused primarily on South African banks and their financing of fossil fuels. We still have very little disclosure in South Africa of how much each of our banks is exposed to climate risk. We work a lot with asset managers and institutional investors to try to get them to understand their responsibilities as active owners and as responsible managers of people's money, how important it is for them to understand climate risk and to push financial institutions and the companies they're invested in to tackle that risk. And we've also done a lot of work around SASL, which is, as you all know, South Africa's biggest carbon emitter, well, Africa's biggest carbon emitter after Eskom, and a really key element of the just transition because of its contribution to the economy and the place that it holds in our economy and the number of people it employs, etc. And we've tabled the first climate risk shareholder resolutions in South Africa. We have now experienced a lot of resistance to that in the corporate sector. So, you know, on the one hand, of course, we need the political will and the political buy-in and the policies and all of those very important things to drive this forward. But on the other hand, if we don't have the concurrence and the willingness of the leaders of the financial sector, the just transition is going to be equally impossible to achieve, as if the politicians do not play their role. Brief summary of what we do. Thanks, Gaylor.
Thanks so much, Tracey. I think that was really on point in terms of exactly the questions that I really wanted us to kind of get into. And as you say, there's real different understanding of the just transition, both in the meaning of the word transition and in the meaning of the word just. So when you put the two together, then you get to an even more diverse kind of set of understanding. And I think we need to, as you say, as the people interested and involved, we can't even agree, then how is this going to transpire to society as a whole is a key issue. And I think there's a lot that we can explore going forward. I don't want to move to our next panelist, Sherman Indu, who is the executive manager for corporate sustainability at Transnet, state-owned enterprise responsible for rail, ports, pipelines in the country. He's worked on sustainability issues, in the public and the private space for more than 15 years, specifically on climate change. He notably sits on the steering committee of the National Business Initiative's Just Transition Pathways Project. So has a deep understanding of what's happening on that front, and also, of course, from a Transnet's perspective, these are some of the key issues, given the crucial role of Transnet in the local and even actually regional economy. So Sherman, pleased to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Gaylor. Apologies, my signal seems to be dropping every now and then, so just if there's any issues, just alert me and try and correct. Thanks. Okay, so I think the context has been set, and I'm just going to get straight into the questions, Gaylor, that you sent us, and kind of talk from that. And some of the stuff has been raised already. Mohammed's raised it, Ashraf and Tracey. So, like Tracey says, I think we're very much in an echo chamber in this discussion. But nevertheless, let's just share our thinking on it. My understanding, always I get a sense that every time we have a conversation on just transition, we focus in on South Africa, and we forget that this transition we're talking about has to happen within a global context and aligned or synchronized to some degree with a global transition. So if we're too fast or too slow in that transition, there's negative impacts for the South African economy. And so we've got to bear that in mind. So we can't view this in isolation by any means. So that's just as a point of departure. Then the transition itself is often, when we get into these conversations, it seems that different people have different time frames in mind when they think about a transition. And I always like to remind anyone I'm in a conversation with that we're talking about something that's going to happen over kind of a 30-year time frame. So there's time and there's space to consider during the discussion. And it's not something that's, we're not going to flip a switch overnight to do anything. Of course, there will be a point at which if we do nothing, and if the global economy moves faster than we do, that switch will get flipped for us, and then then we're in real trouble. So it's about those balancing dimensions. And we said already that it starts with the energy system, and then everything else that then plugs onto that systemically and spreads out throughout the economy. and then this tension that I always hear around just and transition that colleagues have already touched on. You know, we often forget from the climate change lens, if I'm looking at it, just transition is embedded into the IPCC statements. I mean, it's been there from day one. And so it's never been something that's an add-on in the climate change discussion. It's always been one of the fundamental principles. And we often forget that in the conversations. And then we, like Tracey mentioned, you know, we start having these debates and then we say, oh, we can't transition because of a social dimension, which is key. But I think it's a lot to do with the kind of tools we're using in business and our understanding of how to use those tools, because it's not something that we have learned. You know, everyone that's in the business environment is dealing with climate change and just transition issues that no one has been trained to deal with, right? So the skill sets and how we address these things were never taught to us. We've never had to kind of like learn what are the tools that we use to do this. Everyone's learning as they're going along. And I think this is one of the reasons why there's this diversity of opinions. The rhetoric is different. The lingo, Gaylor, you mentioned, all these different aspects is because there's never been a foundation that we've all moved from. We've all come to it from different perspectives and ideas, and so it's very difficult to get this kind of convergence. So yeah, that's just some of this. The other aspect on diversity of views also is, you know, this global kind of polarization theme that's flowing across the world also plays into the climate space. Less so these days, I find, around climate change denialism. I think that's kind of very, you know, yesterday. But it's become more around polarizing the views, and how that plays out is in this, and I think it's come very sharply here in this discussion around zero versus net zero. Those are two very different worlds with very different economic systems and industrial structural systems and policy requirements to deliver them. And so we need to bear that in mind. And this cognitive dissonance of being comfortable with using these as interchangeable terms is a problem. It's a problem because it drives different agendas and different endpoints, right? So I think, you know, that's something we've got to understand. Yeah, what else can I say? No, I mean, there's so much in the space. You know, I think fundamentally, if I had to sum it up, it's really about how do you structurally change the South African economy over a 30-year time frame, taking into account that it has to be just, but at the same time realizing that, in my opinion, it is not going to be an orderly transition, right? There will definitely be wins and there will be losses in the short term. There's more opportunity for wins in the long term, and there's more opportunity for everybody if we all take a longer term view than a short term view, which is the most difficult thing for business environments to do, because we are incentivized and we are structured on 3-month to 12-month cycles of performance. And so, you know, having those discussions are difficult. Maybe, and just as a closing statement, I think the education stuff is important. It's really important. And I think we need to be doing it from all over the system. I mean, I think, you know, directors on boards need to be climate competent to understand very acutely what transition risk means for their companies that they on the boards that they sit on, and have a strong drive towards understanding this and getting it embedded into corporate thinking. Thanks, Gaylor. I think I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Great, Chairman. Thank you. Thanks so much. I think you really touched on some of those key issues that we really need to engage with. I mean, these echo chamber issues for me, I will definitely go back to it because that's a big problem, and I'm sure we solve it. But I think I would really like to hear everyone's views on that. I think that debate around zero versus net zero, as you say, radically different perspective, radical ideas there. I think we globally seems to be more talking about net zero. Zero is a very different ambition, but there is this debate nonetheless, and I think we need to have it. And I think I think for me it is really important to raise that just transition, as much as it's risen to prominence in the last few years. First, it is an old concept, but it's always been embedded. Maybe it wasn't explicit, but it was always embedded in the concept of a transition. It's like when you're talking about green economy, it's not because the word there's green that the inclusive part is not in it. It is embedded, but people tend to forget that because of the words. And I think that's really important that we unpack it and make it very explicit. And I think we need to also unpack the role of the different stakeholders, and we get back to that. What's the role of business? What's the role of a company like Transnet as well in that? And I think we can get back to that in the discussion. But before that, I wanna give the floor to our next panelist, to Jacklyn Cock, who needs no introduction, but never mind, is a professor emeritus in the Department of Sociology at the University of the Witwatersrand at WITS, and an Honorary Research Professor at SWOP, which is the Society Work and Development Research Unit. She has really worked extensively on the topic of environment, gender, militarization, and just transition. And we are very honored to have you with us, Jacklyn. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Gaylor. I'm going to stick to the questions you set us within the time you gave us. My understanding of a just transition is of a very deep transformative process, which involves the redistribution of power and resources to address both environmental destruction and the savage inequalities in our society. And both of these, of course, are exacerbated by the climate crisis, which is driven by coal. And I think it's very important to remember that the concept emerged from a struggle. And the struggle was conducted by the international labor movement, led particularly by the ITUC. And it's now the object of struggle in our context. The concept was introduced by the labor movement, and in its introduction, it was a radical, hopeful notion, as illustrated in Kasatu's climate change policy document of 2011, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, which is an important document because it claimed that making a just transition to a low carbon economy meant, and I'm quoting, putting the needs of working and poor people first in the social and economic changes ahead of us, unquote. And I think that should be our starting point. But, and this is where I disagree with the very bland consensual view, which some of the speakers have put forward, since that beginning, the concept, I think, has been stripped of much of its visionary radical potential and shrunk to mean largely an inevitable shift to a new energy regime. And this is the dominant view of very powerful social forces in our society, including various mining corporations, elements within the National Union of Mine Workers, and particularly powerful is the Mining Council. And I think it all adds up to a failure to recognize the urgency of the climate crisis, coal mining and burning viewed as somehow essential to economic growth and stability. And of course, the state is very contradictory, but on the whole, deeply committed to extractivism. And despite the undertakings in the Paris Agreement of 2015 and President Ramaphosa's commitment to establishing a just transition fund, it is in fact supporting the construction of new coal, and particularly new privatized mines and coal-fired power stations of places I'm thinking of like Tabametsi, Kanyisi, and Musina Makadi. Now, Eskom is, of course, at the center of the tension between reducing carbon emissions and protecting Eskom employees, even though the majority of coal workers at many coal plants, such as Hendrina, where I've done some research, are precarious contract workers employed by labor brokers. So with lower coal prices and increasing pressure on the banks, as Tracey was talking about, to stop financing coal, I think increasing numbers of mining corporations are speaking, and often in a very empty, sloganistic way, of a transition to renewable energy. But the transition they envisage, as our friend from Transnet has said, is of a very slow process, a process that is managed from above and that does not threaten their profitability. Often too, it's part of a so-called new green capitalism based on expanding markets and new technology, but with the same relations of exploitation that we associate with capital. Now, this view is being challenged by a wide range of initiatives and organizations in civil society who are committed to a very different notion of a just transition as the carrier of social and environmental justice. And to mention some examples briefly, the Climate Justice Coalition has initiated a Green New Deal Eskom campaign, which means, quote, a rapid and just transition to a more socially owned renewable energy future, providing clean, safe, and affordable energy with no worker and community left behind, unquote. Another important initiative is the Charter for Climate Justice and a Deep Just Transition, which states 8 very broad principles and a vision of an eco-socialist society, which includes socialized ownership, eco-centric living, which respects nature, food sovereignty, and energy democracy. Lastly, I want to point to the Alternative Information and Development Center, which is focused on, quote, building alliances for a just transition to a wage-led, low-carbon development path. And that is the organization that drives the Climate Jobs campaign and is part of growing support for a basic income grant. But overall, I think the oppositional landscape is very fractured, as Gaylor was saying, with a very deep fault line between two groupings who should be working together and who did so for a brief moment in our past, and that is the labor movement and their support for renewable energy, but not in a privatized form, because that would involve job losses and increased energy prices, and the environmental movement, which is increasingly adamant about the immediate closure of coal mines in whatever form. So these challenges are valuable, but in my view, far too many statements, charters, and manifestos about a just transition are abstract and aspirational rather than agendas which provide strategic direction. And most importantly, they are often not sufficiently grounded in extensive participatory processes with the people who are most impacted by the negativities of coal, and that is coal workers and people living near coal mines and coal-fired power stations. And that is particularly, that is one of my research interests. Many of these communities have experienced dispossession loss of their lands and livelihoods, desecration of ancestral graves, damage to their homes from blasting, the death of animals during forced removals, exposure to pollution, and total exclusion from debates on a just transition. And we have found a very deep ambivalence towards coal in these communities, especially in Mpumalanga, because on the one hand, there is an extensive material dependence on coal, and that's both in relation to employment, as well as the provision of a market for the extensive informal sector activities on which many households depend. And on the other hand, the damage to their health from coal-polluted air and water. So mining-affected communities are increasingly organized, and they are very different. But there is a view expressed sometimes that the just transition is an empty concept. It lacks substantive content and fails to provide a compelling alternative of a world beyond coal. And in a series of exchange workshops, some informants even referred to the just transition as a frightening concept, which would lead to a dark and dangerous world with more hunger, crime, and hopelessness. If we focus on these communities and meeting their needs, we must be talking about a diversification of the entire Mpumalanga economy. So clearly, I think what is needed is a unified movement to reclaim the transformative potential of a truly just transition. In other words, a transition to socialism, but a new socialism, an ecological and ethical and democratic socialism. And only this will ensure justice for the poor and the powerless. In the short term, it requires a massive mobilization of resources and the political will to transcend our, what I would call, shameful present. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jacklyn, very for your powerful message. I think you really sort of also put it back to what's really happening on the ground, which I think is really, and I think that's one of the challenges, which I also want us to sort of get to really, is that policy and decisions tend to be made in a very top-down fashion. I think that's just the way it happens, and everybody can talk about the need for a more bottom-up, grassroots movement, but it's one thing to say we need it, it's another to actually make it happen, so for me, it's I wonder how we merge the two. How do we get that grassroots movement to come and be meaningful? Because you can consult a lot, you can engage a lot, doesn't mean it's meaningful, and it also doesn't mean it's going to have an impact. So maybe just to kick us off with our discussion, I just want to rebound on this, Jacklyn. Just how do you see that sort of bottom-up process happening, and how do you see that it could sort of influence decisions at the national level?
I'm delighted to have the opportunity, because the way we have done this research, and we've been doing it since October 2018, and of course it's become very difficult and impossible almost impossible under lockdown, is a series of what we call exchange workshops, which involve using existing organizations in the community to establish meetings in particular localities near them. And the way we attract people is quite simple. It's by promising a large and substantial lunch, because the hunger in these communities is truly, truly shocking. And I think people might come, and as Tracey said, absolutely right, they've never heard of a just transition and have no conception of one, and no conception of a world beyond coal. But people come, and we divide the day in two, and the morning is spent addressing one question only, and that is, what is it like to live in a mining-affected community? And then we break for, as I say, a substantial lunch, and we're fortunate to be well funded by the Ford Foundation. And that's the opportunity to interact at a personal level, because I don't think any kind of research from a distance can be very, very meaningful in terms of really understanding people's lived experience of extractivism. And then in the afternoon, we talk about different concepts, such as environmental justice, such as the just transition, such as the climate crisis, what is happening in other communities, and the kinds of demands which Groundwork has organized a coal exchange, and people came up with very particular conceptions of justice, for example. And justice for many of them meant compensation for homes which had been damaged by blasting. Being, immediate local issues, often of repayment for damage which had been done to them of different kinds. So there's a massive, massive need for us to learn of what it's like to live with extractivism, and for them to learn about thinking about the larger world and the ideas we can use to struggle for a better world. It needs to be a two-way process, which is why we call it exchange workshops. And it's trying to move away from what is sometimes called extractivist research, which simply extracts information from people and does nothing to empower them. But that is my constant message to everyone who is interested in this issue, to learn from the people on the ground and to share with them.
Thank you. No, I think that's obviously very useful. I mean, as I think some people always mention, there's a lot of people talking about just transition, and we've never actually understood what it means, or even gone to the communities that are at stake here. And I think that's one of the key problems in the sort of top-down processes. I want to rebuild on one of the things that was mentioned, that you mentioned again, and let's go to you, Tracey. And so we operate in this echo chamber you mentioned, and most people don't know about just transition. And I don't dispute that. I think we obviously all operate in a specific world, but I wonder how do we sort of kind of go beyond that, and really make it more open. Of course, there's no purpose just talking among ourselves. Well, there is a purpose. I would hope so, but it's not as meaningful as it could be. And I think that's important to kind of reflect on what could be done in there. Yeah, do you have any sort of view on this?
Excuse me. Yeah, I mean, first of all, I didn't mean to imply that these conversations are not valuable. Of course, I did not. Just that because of the work that we do, where we are, constantly engaging with new audiences, whether it's pension fund trustees or asset managers or, the vast range of people that are players in the financial sector. It constantly brings me up short and reminds me that, this stuff that we talk about as if it's just happening and everybody knows about it, is that is not the case. And so I think, I think what I'm trying to say is that we need to make sure that the messaging that we all put out in our own capacities is messaging that is accessible to people, first of all, and that makes the whole concept relevant to their own lives in whatever sphere it is, whether that's the coal miners in Mpumalanga or the bank executives. That I would say it's actually a lot harder to make it relevant to the lives of the bank executives than it is to make it relevant to the lives of the coal miners. But it's about messaging. I think we can very easily lose people in kind of esoteric conversations, you know, about these issues. And I also think that whilst we've been emphasizing, you know, and I myself said we need a uniform agreement on what a just transition looks like before we can achieve it. I also, and I can see from some of the questions that have been asked, that doesn't mean that it's going to be a nice process where everybody agrees, right? In fact, quite the opposite.
Exactly.
And so what we are increasingly seeing in, and to take, somebody asked a really relevant question about saying that one of the major banks is using the just transition in their recent annual report to justify their investment in coal, because they're saying, you know, we're supporting the South African, you know, kind of socioeconomic situation, and we have to invest in coal in order to grow and develop our economy. And, you know, whatever your views on that, you know, on coal and South Africa's future are, that is certainly a disingenuous use of the word of the term just transition, right? So, you know, we're not going to reach consensus when those kinds of when there's that level of divergence in vested interests. Basically, that's what we're talking about here. And one of the things that we have learned over the course of the last couple of years of our work with the banks is that the vested interests that we're talking about are not necessarily vested interests in fossil fuels. They may be vested interests in other things, but in order to maintain their interests in that, they need to keep investing in fossil fuels. And that is particularly relevant in Africa, where African governments are very keen on new exploitative projects, things like the East African crude oil pipeline, liquid natural gas in Mozambique, all the oil projects in Tanzania and Uganda. You know, there are a lot of big banks that have a big retail presence in those countries. So they may not particularly care about a pipeline, but they do care about their regulatory license and pleasing the government. So, you know, there are all sorts of associated vested interests. It's not just about fossil fuels. And I think it's important to help people to understand those vested interests, because, as I say, this is going to be part consensus and part working together with business and government and labor and civil society, but it's also going to have to be part serious pressure from clients, from shareholders, from regulators, because those vested interests are very deep-seated and they essentially underpin our current economic system.
Tracey, I mean, I just want to rebound just briefly on, there was another question that was raised, which was really on this, you know, kind of the international pressure and sort of the external pressure on shaping South Africa's transition. And I think it's really important. I mean, also Sherman mentioned it, you know, this is not happening inside, or, you know, this is happening within the global landscape. You know, we're not just on our own, you know, and you know, the access to markets, access to finance is going to be impacted going forward. So how do you see that shaping our transition domestically? And that would be important.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a whole excuse me, very bad timing for a cough. There's a whole body of work on things like trade implications and export markets and all of that, which you economists are experts on. From my point of view, and also in relation to the question asked in the chat about external pressure on the financial sector, I think that has huge potential. And I think one of the reasons why South African companies and institutional investors have been so slow to act on climate change is because they haven't experienced that pressure before. But there is a really fast growing awareness amongst the world's biggest asset managers and sovereign wealth funds like the Norwegians, that South Africa is, first of all, you know, a very significant carbon emitter in its own right. But second of all, that the activities of South African financial institutions actually have potential to shape the transition of the whole of Africa, because our banks and many of our other companies have footprints across the continent. So, you know, this pressure is coming, and I don't think that we're remotely prepared for it. And one of the things that we are working on is a much broader kind of collaboration with international investors to focus on these things. And just to give you a quick example, there is a global investor initiative called Climate Action 100+, which sounds very civil society-ish, but it is nothing of the sort. It is a coalition of the world's something like $50 trillion worth of assets under management, the world's biggest asset managers. And they are targeting, sort of one by one, the world's big fossil fuel emitters to force them to take faster action on climate change. There are a lot of problems with the coalition, and it's not perfect. But last week, they wrote to the CEOs and boards of every single company on their target list, of which Sasol is one, demanding that they put in place net 2050 net zero plans, which immediately has an impact on the emission reduction targets of a company like Sasol, which is currently setting those targets based on what it thinks it can achieve, not what's needed for Paris alignment. So I think that, you know, that's just the tip of the iceberg, and as the realization grows of South Africa's sort of outsized influence from a climate impact point of view, that pressure is going to increasingly become more focused on us as a sort of proxy for the rest of Africa.
Can I comment, Gaylor? Because I think what Tracey's doing is really, really, really significant. And to me, the starting point of your approach is that we have different interests. And in order to be effective, we have to recognize those differences. And I'm very skeptical of, I'm afraid, my colleague here, of the National Planning Commission approach, which assumed that we all have shared interests and therefore social dialogue can arrive at solutions, because I think it's only by recognizing our differences, and in the case of the investors and in the case of very, very desperately poor people living in mining affected communities, it is meeting, the challenge is to meet their needs, and to do so in a way, in the very broad umbrella of a just transition, which could fall apart otherwise, if we try and pretend and smother the divergences in the notion of social dialogue.
Yeah, thanks. I think, Jacklyn. I think that's obviously the difficulty of social dialogue. I think is always, you know, with interest, who gets in, who gets out, the alignments. I think these are some of the issues, and I think we need to do a lot more to impact those differences. I think, you know, we need to embrace those differences. I think it's okay, you know, we don't have to all agree, and I think we all tend to sort of pretend that we all agree, and I think that's a problem, you know, and at the end of the day you start digging and we don't, you know.
Exactly.
Yeah. I want to actually move to Sherman briefly and sort of, you know, rebut on some of the things that were mentioned, to kind of get a sense of, you know, what in your mind is, Sherman, you know, the role of business in that transition, you know, and particularly of, you know, of a company like Transnet, you know, which is obviously a state-owned enterprise, you know, and because it's obviously not directly obvious, you know, how you kind of understand the role of such corporations. For some corporations, I think it's pretty clear, you know, what we're supposed to do, but for others, it's not always very clear what their role should be, you know, particularly when we're talking about a just transition, you know. They're operating in a world which, you know, corporations is obviously a kind of capitalist economy, profit maximizing, you know, so state-owned enterprises should probably operate in a different world, slightly different world, but it's important to kind of understand the differences and the role of various businesses in that transition. So keen to hear, you know, what your views are on that, from a Transnet's perspective, or more, well, I guess generally from a business particularly private versus state-owned enterprise? I think for me, I'm interested in that as well.
Okay, Gaylor. Yeah, that's an interesting, interesting one. I'll tell you why. Because let's look at it from a Transnet point of view. So if I've got my Transnet hat on, I think it's easier to do in a state-owned company because the mandate of the organization is broader. So there's more room on topics that, you know, so I think, yeah, that whole dynamic around, you know, what kind of organization you are plays a role. That's the first thing. The second thing is, even within an organization, I mean, I wear a hat of, you know, climate change within Transnet, but there's cognitive dissonance within Transnet, and there's different views on these things within an organization. So as a practitioner in the space, you have to kind of navigate that view, different views, and that's not easy at all to do, because they are entrenched opinions that you've got to influence, and it's a challenging you know path to navigate, but that's your role. So you do it to the best of your ability, and I can tell you that it's become easier in the last few years. So the conversation is moving up, and it's becoming more real for people. So you know, a few years ago, if I had a conversation within Transnet about thermal coal exports, I would get very polarized opinions on the future of coal. I think today, if I had that conversation, those poles have moved closer together. There's a real global legacy industry that is on its downward trajectory over time. The discussion now is, like Jacklyn mentioned, it's the timing of how this happens, right? It's kind of, is it 10 years, is it 20 years, or 30 years? I mean, and so that's where the debates are currently around transition. I think in the industry as a whole, it's more difficult. I think, you know, if you're working in a company, a listed company that is energy intensive or an energy based company, your role as climate change, from a climate change perspective, is a very, very complex and difficult role within an organization. You will basically have to tell the leadership of that company that your business model does not exist in the future, and you need to change that business model. And that's not an easy conversation as a climate change lead to have, where you hold very little power, very little influence within the organization, to be able to tell, you know, your strategy teams and your C-level executives that you need to change the complete future direction of this company. And if you don't do it, you know, they're just going to either tell you, you know, what are you smoking, or you have no idea what you're talking about. I think that has changed. I think the realization has changed, and it's been through the work of organizations like Just Share that have raised the issue. And so as practitioners within organizations, what you need external signals that come from activism organizations and come from financial institutions that kind of pick up flags that say, these are the directions you need to be moving in. And so what happens is when that does happen, and say, for instance, there is some indication that there's a decline maybe in fossil fuel over the next 20, let's not talk about coal. Let's talk about petroleum. There will have to be a decline of petroleum if we're going zero carbon. That has to happen. If we're saying zero carbon by 2050, that's a non-negotiable position, and that has to happen. And there's capital infrastructure and investment that has been made. There's assets in place that have to be sweated before that time kind of time frame expires. Now the question is, as an organization and as decision makers within organizations, you can't have mixed signals coming from your funding institutions, for example, where, you know, one day the position is, yes, TCFD is critical, and we need to start embedding all these things in, and we support this. And so then 2 days later or a week later, there's a different message coming from the same financial institution, from a different department in the same financial institution, giving a completely different message. So how are you supposed to influence change within one organization when the marketplace that gives you the signals of change have no kind of convergent view of it?
But I think we got a lot. I mean, let's move on. I think there were some really important points that were made by Sherman, and one of them that I want to go back to is mixed signals. You know, we get a lot of mixed signals, and I think that's really, you know, we get a lot of mixed signals from business and from, you know, various players. But one of the points that was also mentioned, and I want to, you know, go to you, Ashraf, is we get a lot of mixed signals from government. From the one end, you know, there's this desire to have government play a strong leading role in driving just transition, and there's many, I guess, many messages and intentions that have been clear in that respect. But on the other end, we get almost the complete opposite at times, you know, in terms of the signals that are being sent from government, in terms of, you know, the nature of the economy, and particularly the extractive nature of the economy, and then sort of, you know, the role of those economic sectors in society. So, Ashraf, maybe could you try and reflect on how can we, I don't know, how can we kind of bridge that divide? I mean, how can we get a clear picture coming? Because that's, for me, if we can't get a clear picture from government, then of course we can't expect a clear picture from everyone else in the economy and in society. You know, you should try and get a very clear picture coming from government. Any thought on that, Ashraf?
Yeah. Okay. No, I'm with you in the same. I first want to make let me first make the one point. As you understand, and as I am here invited as a member of the NPC secretariat, I don't think there's such a big mixed message coming out of the National Planning Commission itself, right? I mean,
yeah,
consistent there within as an advisory body, they have been clear of what they want and the support for it. I just want to make that point, right? Now and now I'm speaking as a civil servant, right? Within broad government, right? If you look at it, I mean, there has been a fair amount of mixed signals between various departments. Clearly, the Department of Environmental Affairs, etc., it's a major supporter, etc., for a just transition, and has led to a large extent, right? However, given the changes sometimes within the civil service, even that message within the department has become a little bit, what do you call it, a little bit mixed, as the word you use. Then, of course, on the other side, if you take a department like energy, right? Clearly, there's never truly been fully supportive of it, right? Of a just transition, or it has a different view of what the Department of Environment has on these matters. So, in that sense, and I want to say this is almost normal, right? If you think of any broad policy process within the state, you will have these to and fro on policy positions, depending on interest groups, depending on departmental mandates, etc., that needs to be consulted. So it's almost a reflection of broader society that takes place within the state. So that is something that we all expect. However, if you look at, I mean, even under the previous state, right, the Zuma regime, if you look at it consistently, right? There's been from the top, there's consistently been in terms of, and here I'm talking about actual things. So for example, we did sign Paris, we did make a commitment on etc. So there is, at the top, there is this line that says, yes, I mean, South African government as an institution is supportive of a just transition and the movement towards it, right? And then you have the various things at the bottom that reflects it. It is the question for me rather is how do you ensure, right? And this is about, again, the ability of our state to respond, right? And it's about it's the capacity, but the skills levels within it, right? Of how to ensure that there is a coordinated approach on this from a policy perspective. And it might not be because of a lack of commitment towards climate change or the just transition. It might just be the fact that there isn't the necessary capacity or the coordinating mechanisms within the state to ensure that things take place. So that's what I think where you also get a lot of these mixed messaging and mixed actions from. That's the one issue. I actually think there's a bigger issue for generally for just transition, but for a lot of other policy positions in the state going forward now, given the impact of what the coronavirus has done, or the COVID epidemic, whatever you call it, has done for economic development for us, right, as a country, we need to be very careful of how you take the longer term issues, the matter of climate change and how we transition to it, and what we do in the short term to get the economy back on its feet, right? If you look at, even if you look at yesterday's message, right, you will see, or to deal, there's now a general understanding that the only way to get this economy going is to ensure there's enough electricity or energy supply. Well, electricity going forward, right? You're not going to get the economy moving if you don't sort out that problem, right? So from a short-term perspective and from an immediate action point, you will see this, the reason I believe this coal was in that mixture is because that is probably the only response government can see as a way as an immediate action. So how do you deal with these issues, with these broader term issues in relation to what is the short-term needs? And those are some of the issues that we actually have to consider, because you might be losing the long term if we don't find a solution on some of these short-term issues or find some level of agreement on it. Then I just wanted to make one more point, and that's about when Jacklyn made the question about the approach of the MPC on consultative forum. I think it's given the fact that we are not a very homogeneous society, it's important, and I think it's something that's inbred in the politics of the state even now, particularly with the current government, that consensus seeking is the only way forward, right? Yes, you can try to accentuate the differences, but that in itself, given the nature of our society, given how different we are and the different interests, the only way forward, I think, within the state's view is that you need to take a view of trying to find a consensus. Because if you try to drive things to a cliff, you sometimes we might end up in a worse position than what you think you're going to be, given the nature of the differences. I just want to make those points.
Thanks, Ashraf. I think that, and I think I want to kind of go back to this issue of sort of, I think we need consensus, but we also need evidence, I think, as well. And I think that's important. There's a lot of, it's a very emotive subject, of course, because it's a very important subject, but it's, the need for evidence as well to make sure that we actually, make the right decision is really important. And that's some of the work that, we try to do as well. And we're obviously not by far the only people trying to do that through the NEO and the SGRP work, and Marvin can come in as well, and just to really be we spoke to anyone who wanted to speak with us, to be honest, at this point, and we forced ourselves to have sometimes some very difficult discussions, when we went to speak to the Coal Transporter Forum, that was a difficult discussion, in terms of course, their understanding of just transition and the impact it's going to have on them, but also trying to bring it, from a quite comprehensive view in terms of knowledge, from workers to communities to small businesses through an entire value chain. And I think we tend to focus too much often on one particular hotspot when actually it has ramifications throughout the economy. And I think we mustn't see the just transition only as an intervention or a project. It really is a process, and I think that's what some of the things that we wanted to also highlight. I don't know, do you want to comment briefly on this and sort of?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, on your first point, in the SJRP project, we consulted widely, and I think this kind of extends Jacklyn's earlier point about understanding things on the grounds and the perceptions and beliefs of people that are actually in the midst of the actual transition and perhaps don't fully understand. So, for example, when we met with the Coal Transporters Forum, which is really a collection of small and vulnerable coal transporters in Mpumalanga, the understanding was that we're just about getting off the ground. We've got our small businesses, we've invested a bit of capital, we've got a few trucks, and people are coming here now with this climate change story, and why does this have to be like this? Perhaps even in some conversations expressing skepticism about climate change. Is it really a thing? I mean, can't we just carry on? So it's very important to understand applied to understand people's perceptions, and to take that into account when you want to try and think about what a just transition means and moving that forward. Yeah, definitely.
You see, I think it's completely impossible to reach consensus in the broad sense in a society as unequal as ours. The divisions between the rich and the poor are so extreme and are growing. And what's, to me, is hopeful about the notion of the just transition is that it is anchored in the one process which could unite us, and that is the climate crisis. And that's a starting point. And gosh, if you talk about people not knowing about the just transition, I mean, I have been very shocked by how little people in mining affected areas know about the climate change, even though they experience drought and high temperatures, which are some of the shocks of climate change. But certainly there's very little understanding of this as a global process which does threaten human existence, or the existence of all forms of life. But the only provision, the only qualification I would make to that as a possible unifying basis, because that is what the whole just transition is a response to, is the climate crisis. But the impacts and the shocks of the climate crisis are experienced very differently. The differences between the people who are lucky to have one candle compared to the rich who can afford to have their own generators, if we're talking about energy. And one could point to the same wide extremes in anything we could imagine, that the impacts and the negativities of coal are experienced most intensely by the poor and the powerless, and often those living near coal mines and coal-fired power stations. Now, this is a basis. The climate crisis constitutes a basis from which we can build. But there's got to be shared knowledge and shared understanding, and I think that we all agree upon. And that's, Gaylor, is the importance of events like this. I think it's important to bring us together, but it's got to happen in a much, much wider context, and you've got to bring in more people from these communities and more people from labor, though I imagine you've tried. But this is what needs to happen, in my view.
I just want to rebuttal on this.
There's potential with the notion of just transition. There's a potential optimism built in.
I think I just want to rebuttal on this one thing. I mean, you know, welcome to come in. Is we know the urgency though. There's a significant urgency to act, both from I think a climate change perspective, an inequality perspective, a just transition perspective, and I think when there is urgency, well, okay, sometimes we see no action, and that's a problem. And with the action, often it's very top down. Okay, it's very say, okay, if someone decides, no, we need to act, we're going to do something, and that could be top down at a corporate level, or it could be, you know, at a government level, or even for unions. You know, it could be also quite top down in some cases. How do you get citizens to have a voice in here? You know, particularly citizens who, as you say, you know, I've got other worries, you know, which is about really surviving you know, for them. How do they get to have a voice in that process?
Well, one has to create spaces. And this is what the National Planning Commission tried to do. Well, certainly but at the start, it got absolutely no buy-in from labor or communities. And I attended all those meetings because I was very disappointed, because I saw that as possibly providing a platform. But I think that it has to start by addressing people's lived experience and their material needs. And that could be a way, and the National Planning Commission never managed to do that, because I tried hard to persuade people from the labor movement to attend meetings, for example, and the answer was always, there's nothing in it for labor. It's simply another version of neoliberalism. But I think one's got to start with people's actual material needs and then create the spaces that can be used to both for people like us to learn about what's it like to live in a mining affected area and what the climate shocks are at present and are likely to worsen, and for them to learn about alternatives and concrete alternatives which meet needs, alternatives to do with food, energy, water, all the things which people lack in their everyday lives. And also, those are material things, but I think, Gaylor, it's also important for people to have the confidence to speak, to challenge government officials and to formulate demands. Because at the moment, people often lack the knowledge and lack the confidence to participate and contribute. But this is something that affects all of us. So people have to be empowered. People have to be supported and built in their capacity to participate in a truly inclusive democratic process.
Thanks, Jacklyn. I wonder, Tracey, if you want to comment on this, because Just Share is about shareholder activism, which at the end of the day is about citizen activism, and it also comes from a broader movement, so in terms of how do we empower citizens to play a bigger role, I mean, whether or not you can have shares in the company. I mean, most people can't afford to have shares in the company anyway to have that kind of activism, but I don't think that means everyone is powerless, though. So it's really important to understand the kind of movement that's required to do that.
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, what people forget when you're talking about asset managers and listed companies and financial institutions is that they manage money on behalf of millions and millions of people. Most of whom only have a tiny, tiny, tiny portion of that. And you know, that's one of the reasons why we are trying very hard to focus our work on pension funds, and particularly the union pension funds in this country, because you know, they have a really
clever.
A very big chunk of our, I mean, the PIC manages money on behalf of the Government Employees Pension Fund, which is one of the biggest asset owners on the planet, you know. So the power for those entities and institutions, if they were responsibly managing the money of their clients in a way that actually took into account the socio-economic and environmental impacts of climate change, we would see very, very rapid movement. But, you know, they are partially, as you know, disempowered in the sense that some of those trustees don't necessarily have the financial expertise. They put those investments into the hands of asset managers and asset consultants. You know, they kind of outsource their responsibilities. And, you know, it's yet another, South Africa, the list is so long, another failure of accountability. I mean, in South Africa, pension fund trustees have a legal obligation to factor climate risk into their investment decision-making processes, a legal obligation. And if this were America, I can assure you that there would be a stack of litigation pending against the Government Employees Pension Fund for failing to tackle climate risk, which is now already impacting their members, you know. So in a sense, you know, shareholder activism is about the masses and the you know, the people who spent their lives saving so that they can retire in some sort of comfort. And what we see with the way money is managed in South Africa in the financial system is that those funds are invested, in companies which, quite frankly, are either stranded assets or are investing in stranded assets themselves, which means that the value of those pension funds when they come to retire will not be sufficient to sustain them in their retirement. And second of all, the world into which those people retire will be one which is characterized by you know, all the things that the just transition is trying to prevent. So I mean, I don't think it's realistic to expect every South African with a pension fund to get involved in tackling climate change or the just transition. I mean, people have their lives to live, and you know, their daily survival to consider. But the people who have a fiduciary duty to manage that money so that we don't just use it to destroy the planet are ones that we should be putting pressure on. And that's what we're trying to do. And one of the things that we strongly feel is that in South Africa, there is no culture of you know, penalizing those institutions for not doing, you know, people don't move their bank accounts. They don't shift their asset managers. You get someone to manage a pension when you're 28 and that person is still managing it when you're 78. You know, there are no consequences for the fact that these financial institutions are not doing what they should do. And these are legal obligations, you know. So yeah, that is about and anyone with even 20 Rand invested in the stock market can have an impact on that. I mean, I can't tell you the impact it has every time someone writes to Alan Gray or Coronation or Prudential or whoever it is saying, what the heck are you doing about climate change? You know, one or two, if they were flooded with inquiries from their clients about what they're doing about these issues, we would see a very different landscape in the financial sector.
Yeah. And Tracey, I mean, there was a question, but in the chat as well, which it speaks to that as well, and it's the question I think people in that space get asked all the time. You know, how do you fund this? How do you finance this? You know, but I think what you're pointing to, there's no lack of money. I mean, you know, there's a lot of money, and I think it's about shifting where it's going. Yeah. And I think that's a lot of that needs to happen.
Exactly, and that there's a huge role that that the financial institutions can play in that, obviously, but that again, unfortunately, is where we come back to the policy signals from government. And I'm afraid I have to thoroughly disagree with Ashraf in relation to there being a consistent policy message from the top of government in this country, because I don't think that's true.
I agree.
And I also think we're falling back. I mean, Ashraf, please correct me if I misinterpreted you, but if you were suggesting that we need to focus on coal to get us out of the economic hole we're in after COVID, you know, this is to me so extraordinary, because the hole we were in before COVID was a result of the disaster of our fossil fuel based economy. It was a result of ESCOM and, you know, the shutting down of manufacturing because we don't have electricity, and the failure to manage our energy systems. You know, if we'd invested in renewable energy and all of the incredible things that you can do nowadays, 10 or 15 years ago, we simply wouldn't be in this mess. And yet now the government is saying again, you know, we've got to build more coal power stations to get us out of the hole we're in after COVID. It's insanity. I'll shut up.
Absolutely right.
Thanks, Tracey. Thanks, Tracey. Before I hand over back to Ashraf, just to get his view on that, I want to direct a question to Sherman, because he's connected and he's facing some challenges with his connection, so I want to make sure he's still here. And I guess there was a question in the chat about, you know, Transnet's coal line as well, you know, whatever coal line capacity. But for me, I mean, it's important, but I also want to, you know, whether or not Transnet was going to expand that capacity. But I think for me, it brings a bigger question as well. Yeah. How is climate change and how is just transition impacting companies' decision in terms of investment? Ultimately, it's about business model, of course. You know, how is this going to impact your business model going forward? And in the case of Transnet, you manage a lot of the logistics and movement of goods in the country. So, of course, some of that is not directly within your control. You know, you have to react to what's happening in the economy, of course. But some is, you know, and I think it's super important to understand how is that starting, or how is the just transition starting to impact the decisions that Transnet makes as a business. You know, I mean, and we can take it beyond Transnet as well, but I think it's important to start getting your views on this. Yeah.
Okay, Gaylor, thanks. So, I mean, undoubtedly, from a Transnet point of view, the transition is in play already. It's not something that's going to happen. We are in it. And I can say why I say that is because I've seen decision-making processes shift in the last 3 to 5 years. And a lot of that is because of what is expected from future revenue streams from commodities that are linked to fossil fuels. And so once there's a realization, you know, that this revenue stream is going to decline over time, the amount of capital investment in increasing capacity obviously has to decrease or stop completely, which is happening. And you can see the decision gates in these large, massive capital investment projects start to be re-looked at. And so these things are in play. Absolutely, they're in play. Of course, at the same time, the complexity comes in saying, well, how much of maintenance do you still need? Because, you know, you still have to operate something. You have to operate it safely for as long as it does exist. And so that has to happen. And then the thinking now, it starts to shift to, well, what can we do in the future with that asset base? How can we repurpose that asset base to move something different in a post-fossil fuel economy? And so the conversation and the thinking is starting to move in that sort of direction. It isn't superly advanced, but at least it has moved, and those conversations are happening. You'll see it in our integrated annual report this year when it comes out. It's very clear in there what direction Transnet is moving in terms of climate change response, aligning to 1.5 degree world. So yeah, I guess, Gaylor, the point is that we have to make decisions, and we have to make it in the face of the fact that there is no certainty. There is no consistent, coordinated direction, and you have to make best guesses based on scenario planning approaches on what decisions you need to be making today. And you've got to hedge those bets because the signals are not clear. And so when the signals are not clear, there's room for dissident voices around a table to shift the discussion in different directions. Even if 98% of the evidence says we're going, north, the 2% at the table that says south sounds like 50% of the conversation. It's like in social media today, the only voices that make it to the top are one or two of the loudest, and they don't represent everybody. So that kind of thinking and ethos plays out in our spaces. So we need clear signals and from everybody. But the reality is we're not going to get that. Let's just accept that that's not going to happen.
But Sherman, what about
Jacklyn,
what the president is saying about the climate change coordinating committee?
Yeah, where is it, Jacklyn?
Well, no, I'm asking you. I mean, do you think, are you pessimistic about that as well?
No, I'm not pessimistic. I mean, if that happens, when it happens, that's great. But I don't, and this is a personal view, I don't believe in the grand architect ideology of this thing. I don't think it's going to happen like that. And that's just my view. And it's kind of like the philosophy I'm moving forward in the work we do, saying what is the best bet and how do we move given that there is no coordinated approach. If there is, awesome. I mean, that's the best bet. Then, it makes everything happen like we want to. But I think we hope for that, but we plan for the fact that there's large uncertainty, large uncoordinated complexity, multiple perspectives, coercive forces within the system,
and no
all sorts of
leadership. And no effective leadership.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't think there's such a thing as effective leadership in the world we live in, Jacklyn. I don't think it exists anymore, that's probably just a clouded view coming in. But I mean, I'm not seeing it anywhere in the world right now. So, why should it be anywhere else?
Yeah.
I'm just saying we need capital to flow to where it needs to flow. And we need the one piece that I think I'm really interested in and I'm watching carefully is an idea of some sort of climate transition fund. Now, if this work that the NBI is doing can create the basis to get some sort of climate transition fund in place, and if we can link that into Jacklyn's view of the world to support the people that are going to be most vulnerably affected by a transition, then I think even without any coordination, we've created enough momentum to move us in the right direction, So I mean, that's, and let me just say one last thing, Gaylor, while I'm there. It's very likely, and it's plausible to say that this transition that we're talking about will at some point become a climate change adaptation discussion. That's a reality that we have to face, is that for every year we lose in trying to get some sort of coordinated approach, we've got to start preparing for adaptation and adaptation response. This is a reality, and I can tell you that every company that I know of, that I've engaged with in South Africa, has a climate change mitigation strategy, and they have a climate change adaptation strategy. And through cognitive dissonance, they both are happening simultaneously within these companies, and we're preparing for the worst, and we're planning to move to what we've got to do. Yeah. Okay, I'll stop because the signal's really bad. Sorry, Gaylor, I don't know what's going on.
Thanks, Trevor. No, I think that was really important. I was letting you guys go because I think it's great. To hear some good discussion there, really some robust discussion. I am conscious of time, and I want to give Ashraf the opportunity to come in here, just to react to obviously what what was raised earlier. Just trying to, I guess, Ashraf, just to, I guess, obviously clarify, and also Ashraf, how do you see kind of, the alignment between a sort of recovery from COVID and this transition that's underway? And for me, a question that's important, and that's been raised actually in one of the questions, is, can we achieve any of our goals from a just transition if we don't have a very strong redistributive system, mechanism, like a basic income grant or any sort of mechanism that's really going to address poverty and inequality? Are we then, if we don't have that, then are we just kind of talking in a vacuum? So just keen to hear your thought on that, and obviously give you a chance to respond to some of the clarity that was raised earlier.
Thanks for response, because I do think I was misunderstood. I was saying that, and the point is basically this: if the South African economy is going to get out of the current crisis it's in, it needs to deal with a physical constraint on the economy, which is the lack of electricity supply. The only way to get out of it is if you're going to deal with that electricity supply. Therefore, we need to understand that the way government are responding is responding toward that crisis. It's not necessarily at the moment trying to respond to the broader question. Now, it needs to take that into account. So what I was saying, I'm trying to give a warning: if we don't, from a climate change perspective, take into account the fact that government actually needs to respond to this crisis, right? And find solutions for government that will deal with it, to get out of it, we are going to see these type of responses. That's the point I was trying to make, right? And hopefully that's understandable. On the broader question, on the question of redistributive, from the beginning, I think since 1994, there has been a general understanding, right, that you need to deal both with the issues of poverty, right, and the immediate crisis, but you also need to deal with the question of inequality and finding a more equal society. Now, the question specifically on the, now government response since 1994 was to say, yes, we will establish a grant system, etc., as developed, but more importantly, we will ensure people's basic needs are met, right? So we will ensure issues of water provision, housing, electricity, etc., is all provided with education, and that will hopefully deal with the question of inequality as we move forward. I think, and this is now my personal opinion, right? I actually think, given the problems with corruption, etc., and that a lot of money is being lost through when government actually spends the money, right? Through government expenditure, a lot of money is lost, it gets leaked. That maybe a better strategy is to get money directly into the hands of people, a much more simpler system that you can control leaks, or that's the word I'll use, leaks, better, right? So maybe then the question of a basic income grant becomes a better option to get money to people, and as a measure to equalize and to try to do this basic needs approach strategy. So maybe we need to start thinking about it in that fashion, right? I do not think you can have both at the same time at the moment, given fiscal positions, right? Or fiscal, what is fiscally sustainable. So I think you as a society, we might need to make that choice going forward on those issues. Is there anything else that I needed to respond to? Oh yes, I'm just trying to on the question of government response from a policy perspective. If you think about policy, and this is the point I was trying to make on general policy in terms of climate change, just transition, etc. I actually think from a national point of view, right? There has been to and fro between different departments, etc. But I actually think from an action, if you look at government's actions on it, right? Now I know you can argue that building Medupi and Kusile was an action to show that it is not so, right? But I think our commitments towards Paris, etc., right, also shows government's willingness to deal with the issue of climate change. And this is just, and Medupi and Kusile, you have to understand, it was, those decisions was taken in the period between 2003 to 2009, right? Where those big decisions was taken. And if you look at post that and then the response towards the need to start dealing with climate change, it's only something that really within the policy debate started getting serious attention within the state from around probably 2009 onwards, right? Although there was discussions prior to that in the early 2000s in government, where it became official policy, it's only post 2009, and that was the point I was making. Yes, and I'm just talking here specifically pure policy making and pure policy decision making. I don't think anyone in government, there's and the point I'm trying to make, there is no like in the US, right? What do they call them? Anti-climate conspiracy or anything within the state. I think there's a genuine understanding within current government, right? That is very pro-climate change, right? And pro-just transition. There might be differences of what we need to do and what we should do at a particular moment in time. But I don't think we've got anti-climate changes within the state itself. And that's my broad point on that one that I was trying to make.
Thanks, Ashraf. Thanks, Ashraf. I think that does clarify, some of the points. And I think there is, I think, importantly, this increasing alignment, between green economy, just transition, our recovery, and I think there's been a lot of work done on that, the need to align those dynamics, and I think we, certainly need to seize this opportunity going forward. I think there is a unique opportunity, to make that alignment explicit. On that, I know we could go on for hours, but we are already behind schedule and over time. So want us to come to a close now, and really it remains for me to really thank all of you. I think we've had some really robust discussion, and I was really happy to see some of the interventions and going really back and forth. We need those robust discussions. I think that's also why we're having those dialogues. We're trying not to bring a panel with 4 people who got exactly the same view, going to say 4 times the same thing. Otherwise, it's not really going to be really interesting. So really trying to bring some diversity of views, background, and I think hopefully we can ever so slightly move the needle bit by bit in that respect. Just to say that we will continue to have those dialogues a lot more regularly. The next couple of dialogues will also include a bit more of research findings from people involved in research. So we want to share a bit more some of the research that we've been doing and that others have been doing. So watch out for the invite that should be out pretty soon. One of the things that we're also doing, I just want to raise, that we're busy compiling a bit of a repository for any sort of just transition, relevant documentation, research, information that we're busy putting together, and hopefully we can share that at our next event, just to make the information accessible to everyone, irrespective of views and background. Everyone should have access to all this information. So watch out for that as well. I really want to thank all my panelists, Jacklyn, Tracey, Ashraf, Sherman, Mohammed. I think we had a really great session. Thank you all who attended. The recording will be available as well online, probably later this week. Please reach out to us, stay engaged. As I said, we're building this repository, so if you have any resources that you think we should include, please feel free to send it to us as well. We've already done a good work at trying to get everything that's out there, but we may be missing some. Thank you so much again, everyone, and I wish you all a very good day further.